remember that guy who peaked in high school? You know, the kind of person who had everything going for them. And then the second that last yearbook was signed and they were kicked out the door, they just sort of paused, never growing or changing while everyone else in their life just kind of moved on. Well, I'm gonna guess that the answer is no, because that's just a made-up movie trope that no one actually thinks exists. And even if it did, it hasn't been relevant in like 15 years. And speaking of someone who hasn't been relevant in about 15 years, Jason Todd. Yeah, if you remember the last go-around, we discussed this key character in the Batman mythology, the failed prodigy, the one who Bruce could not save. And if you recall, I mentioned that this character had two of the most impactful stories in the Caped Crusaders catalog, Under the Red Hood and A Death in the Family. And while this is very much true, much like that guy that Hollywood is trying to convince me exists, Jason 2 hasn't been relevant since his heyday all the way back in around the mid-2000s. Like, the honest truth is that most people with a passing interest in comic books are aware of this character, but can only tell you two things about him: the time that he was killed and the time he came back to life. Maybe you'll get an odd man out who'll say Red Hood and the Outlaws, but outside of that, it's pretty slim pickings for stories starring this guy. And this is no clearer in the fact that every single adaptation that he's had, few and far between as they are, has been pretty much centered around these two stories. And as we step foot into a brand new DC universe, the question has to be asked, what do they intend to do with this fallen Robin? So that's what I want to look into today. What can we learn from the previous adaptations of this character? Why do they always seem to follow these two stories? And what are the hurdles and challenges that the folks at DC are going to face trying to bring this ally turned enemy to the big screen? So, let's discuss. So for those of you just tuning in, Jason Todd has something of a storied history in the Batman mythology. Being viewed as one of Batman's greatest failures, he is well known as the Robin that Bruce couldn't save. Going from being the next boy wonder to taking on the mantle once held by his greatest adversary. And like anyone would imagine, this is a setup that can yield some of the most interesting storytelling you could feasibly think of. The tale of a master having to face off against their fallen apprentice is as old as time itself, and has been used in some of the most popular stories ever conceived of. Things like Star Wars with Obi-Wan and Anakin, Arthurian legend with Merlin and Morgan Le Fay, and Kung Fu Panda with Master Sifu and Tai Lung. Yeah, aside from studying under their mentor and not leaving them a like, comment, and maybe even subscribing, wink wink, these proteges all took a sinister turn that led them on a collision course with their once beloved masters, culminating in a conflict that's not just fist to fist, but also a battle that cuts to their very soul. So it's inevitable that Batman, a superhero who's one of the most popular of all time, would find himself partaking in this story structure. And doing so by digging up his greatest failure and putting a little bow on it. Or helmet in case we're losing the metaphor.
Metaphor. This is all so confusing.
And that's how we find ourselves with Jason Todd as the modern day Red Hood. And you can believe that everyone doing an adaptation of this character is aware of this, because each storyteller who's facilitated this character's transition from one medium to another has defaulted to telling some version of this tale. Now, since Jason Todd's turn to being the Red Hood only happened in the comic books around 2005, it stands to reason that there wouldn't be nearly as many interpretations outside of the comic books as the Caped Crusader himself. Also, expect spoilers for everything I'm about to discuss. The first real example we can point to of this character outside the medium of comics is in his seminal animated film, Batman Under the Red Hood, which I to this day think is the best interpretation of this character.
Then the three of us, and then one with the crowbar. Then... That's why he's the GOAT!
Really going deep into the psychology of what this life can do to a person, especially one who's already got his fair share of demons he's fighting. This movie both manages to do justice to its source material, while also finding a way to streamline a lot of the more convoluted and unnecessary elements, creating, in my opinion, what is a perfect adaptation of a comic book storyline. I'd even go far as to say that this film rivals many of the live-action movies Batman has received. The sad thing, though, is that because this is my favorite interpretation of the character, that means moving on, it's kind of all downhill from here. Not that there's all much to go through, considering the fact that Jason is pretty much all but absent from alternative Batman media. There have only ever been 3 other times in which this character has been adapted, beyond just being a memorial to the fallen Robin, or a blink and you miss it cameo. One of which I'll be saving to the end because the first 2 really adapt the same storyline. Starting with his appearance in the series Titans, this show had, to put it lightly, a lot of problems.
Titans are back, bitches! Woo!
From its tone, to its depictions of its characters, to its rushed nature, a lot in this show doesn't work. And unfortunately, amongst them is their depiction of Jason Todd. Jason is whiny, arrogant, and all in all just unlikable. And I know this is kind of in line with how he acts in the comics, but for one, he was so disliked that people actually voted to kill him. And two, there are ways you can write characters like this where they're still sympathetic, and you're not just counting the minutes until whatever scene they're in comes to an end. The problem is you need to have good writing, and Titans doesn't.
Who the f are you? Not super sure yet.
The show struggles to balance its nihilistic, edgy, grimdark tone with its insane, zany goofiness, resulting in it never coming across serious and mature, but instead juvenile and poorly put together. And I got nothing against Curran Walters. It looked like he was trying to do the best he can with what he was given, but I just never bought him as that tortured second Robin, and this is amplified tenfold in the following season when he has to take on the mantle of Red Hood, where he just felt too young and too inexperienced to actually be a credible threat. And I know Jason's age has always been kind of ambiguous in the comics, being somewhere in his late teens to early to mid 20s. But for one, in comics and animation, you can kind of fudge a character's age by just drawing them to look more mature. And two, the way he was presented made him seem like much more of a credible threat. Possibly because it was done in Batman stories rather than Titans, where it's more or less the Dick Grayson show.
Batman.
And listen, I love Dick Grayson and all, but in this particular instance, he's no substitute for the Dark Knight.
Call Bruce. Bruce Wayne? No, Bruce Springsteen.
The relationship between the two is just not the same thing, and because Batman is all but absent from the show, they can't really explore the repercussions of what Jason's death does to his mentor. So all in all, just not a good depiction of this character, but hardly can say much considering the fact that I don't think very highly of the show Titans to begin with. But I mean, at least it's something.
Now you're cooking, baby.
But that leads us into what might just be this character's biggest debut. And I am, of course, talking about what was then the final chapter in the Arkham franchise, until Suicide Squad had to go and ruin it, Batman Arkham Knight. And as a whole, there's a lot to love about this game. From the gameplay to the story, a lot in this package really works. But, and I'm not the first person to point this out in this platform, though maybe the first balloon, the decision to make the concluding chapter of the Arkham series just a retelling of Under the Red Hood wasn't, in my opinion, the best call to make.
It was a bad call.
I do think the story overall is well told, but the whole decision to turn the identity into the Arkham Knight into this big twist reveal inevitably was going to disappoint, especially in this particular story. Because the series never set up a logical successor to the Joker in terms of the main villain of the franchise, there wasn't anyone set up who could take on this mantle that wouldn't have just felt shoehorned in. And they did the best they could with the cards they were dealt, but it still falls short of the animated film it was inspired by. Also, his motivation is completely backwards in this story. What made Under the Red Hood so compelling is that at first it does seem like a revenge story, but the real twist is actually that it's a deconstruction of Batman as a hero. Because as I said in the previous discussion, Jason does not harbor any ill will towards Batman for not being able to save him.
Is that what you think this is about? That you let me die? Bruce, I forgive you for not saving me. But why on God's earth is he still alive?
Which is what you expected. You'd think, oh, he's back from the grave to get his revenge. But by not centering the story on this admittedly self-centered motivation, it reframes the entire story to question whether or not the way Batman dispatches his foes is truly making Gotham a better place. Because Jason's argument is, no, look what it did to me. I'm way worse off than I would have been had you not just put the Joker down once and for all. But by this point in the Arkham series, Joker is already dead, and has been so long before Jason even showed back up in Gotham. So by removing the Clown Prince of Crime and really his center of motivation, all you have left is the hollow revenge tale, and that's just simply not as interesting. Titans had a similar problem, but because the story had never been really all that well told up to that point, it was just the latest in a long list of mistakes this series was making. But in the case of the Arkham franchise, this is some of the best storytelling the character has ever received. You know, when it's not overly indulging in the new tank mechanics. So having this glaring issue in the plot and character motivation does drag the whole thing down. There's one more appearance this character has outside the comics, but we'll save that more towards the end when we get to discussing how I recommend they go about adapting Red Hood in the upcoming DC universe. But for now, let's look into the difficulty in bringing Jason to the big screen that these filmmakers are going to be facing. One of the biggest hurdles they're going to have to contend with is the weird way in which Jason fits in with the rest of the Bat family. You see, while once being Batman's protege, after his death and subsequent resurrection, he takes on much more of an adversarial relationship with the Caped Crusader along with the rest of his cohorts. There are plenty of stories that see Red Hood working alongside Batman and his allies, but they come with their own fair share of caveats. His method of dispatching foes does not align with the rest of the Bat family, and because it's not something they can tolerate, he either can't be part of the team or needs to forego his more lethal approach, which sort of spits in the face of his entire argument, which is the crux of his most famous story. Though having him be on the outskirts and, doing things with his own team, like in the case of Red Hood and the Outlaws, does give the character a chance to extend himself beyond the Bat family, without prematurely having to abandon what I consider to be a crucial part of his character. But the problem with this is, and this is unfortunate to a lot of Red Hood fans, the character's story really kind of peaked with his initial appearance, which is not often the case with many characters. Usually, they'll have a few stories go in, and then eventually they'll have their iconic one that they're associated with. Or maybe they're just a character who's so consistently defined that they resonate with the public zeitgeist, such as the case of Harley Quinn, where even though her only 2 stories you can think of are her initial origin and her breakup with the Joker, because those stories don't really have a definitive end to them, it does allow her to exist in perpetuity and work alongside pretty much anyone without it compromising her character.
Ugh, holy.
It's not so bad.
The point is, there's a clear avenue for her to go down, as opposed to someone like Jason Todd, whose seminal story has a pretty definitive conclusion. I'm not saying the guy dies at the end or nothing, but it definitely sees him being left as something of an antagonist to Batman, and a sore spot that still haunts him to this very day. In fact, a character that he reminds me the most of isn't another Robin, or even any other prominent member of his rogues gallery, but rather the character of Andrea Beaumont from Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Yeah, in this story, we see a similar situation play out, where Batman is unable to save someone who he loves from going down a dark path in pursuit of revenge against the Joker. Wow, they really did just kind of reuse this story now, didn't they? But if you'll notice, after this tale, we never see Andrea again, except for like a few scenes in the Justice League cartoon. She's pretty much gone from the universe after the credits roll, allowing the story to remain a tragic moment in the Dark Knight's history that never really truly heals. And Jason Todd occupies a similar space, and it's why when people think of the character, the first image that comes to mind is either that glass case with the empty Robin costume in it, or their showdown in front of the Joker in that dilapidated apartment complex, which is an incredible scene both in the comics and in the adaptation. And that ending of the animated movie, where we flash back to the first time Jason dons the costume, and he's all excited to go out and fight some crime with his favorite superhero, it's really heartbreaking stuff.
This is the best day of my life.
And I want to stress that it's not impossible to take the character in interesting new directions moving forward. I'm just saying that it's a crazy uphill battle that they're facing when this is the character's origin. And so far, in the comics at least, I don't really think they've ever truly matched it. The character's had some good runs in things like Red Hood and the Outlaws, Battle for the Cowl, though that's not really exclusively a Red Hood story, and my personal favorite, the Red Hood section of the Batman Urban Legends series, seeing the Dark Knight and his disgraced protege teaming up to stop a drug ring while also dealing with their complicated relationship and troubled history. But none of them have had the impact of Under the Red Hood, which is to Batman what the Winter Soldier is to Captain America. A representation of one of his greatest regrets. But much like the Winter Soldier, I think there is a story to be told after their initial run, but it requires a care and attention to detail that they need to be willing to stick with. I haven't mentioned it up to this point, but the game Gotham Knights does give a lot of groundwork for a story like this. And while I haven't played the game myself, I did dive into a lot of the cutscenes, and from what I gather, the way they set up Red Hood's implementation with the rest of the team is an interesting premise. But having extraneous circumstances require Jason to team up with the rest of Batman's disciples, it forces Jason to have to confront his past actions, while also finding his place amongst the rest of the Bat family, and finding a home with them. I'm not so sure how the game actually went out exploring this story, what with it being, a live service game with all the live service elements stripped out, but the premise itself is solid, and allows him to further develop beyond the 2 stories that defined him. Because after all, my biggest issue with the character of Red Hood isn't so much who he is, but rather what he represents. Every Robin has served some purpose in the story that helped define what Batman is and the impact he has on the world. With Dick Grayson, it shows that the life that Bruce leads can have a positive effect on the people that he encounters by giving them strong purpose and a greater sense of self. Tim Drake demonstrates that the legend of the Dark Knight is enough to inspire ordinary people to step up and join him on his crusade of their own volition. Damian shows that even the most violent hearts can be reached through enough care and compassion. And Carrie Kelly shows that the legend of Batman can live on even past the man himself. Also, fun fact, The Dark Knight Returns features an empty Robin case alluding to a dead member of the Bat family 2 years before the release of A Death in the Family. Even Stephanie Brown... Okay, she doesn't really contribute all that much, but what are you gonna do? She was only Robin for like 2 weeks. But yeah, every Robin has contributed something to the Batman mythology and explored an aspect of Bruce himself, and Jason is the one that Batman failed, putting into question if he really can have a positive effect on not just the people in his lives, but the city of Gotham and the world as a whole. It's an interesting question to ask, and something that the cyclical nature of comic books has a difficult time exploring past this one seminal story. Mainline comics often exist in this weird limbo space, where they can't be allowed to progress too far. Sure, someone like Dick Grayson can grow older to become Nightwing, but there comes a point where they reach a status quo that they can't really move beyond. And Jason fluctuates between the status quo of on the outskirts of the Bat family to a reoccurring member that they can reach at a moment's notice. Luckily though, with the medium of film and television, using flesh and blood actors, this permanent cycle of repeating the same stories over and over again isn't something they can afford to do, just by the sheer nature of the actors logistically aging. So even though I do have my issues of how Red Hood in the comics is handled, I think they can be allowed to actually progress the character and relationship of Red Hood and Batman, creating permanent changes in how they operate. Seeing Jason and Bruce working to get back on good terms, or possibly taking him in an irredeemable direction where he's never truly part of the Bat family again. But whatever they choose, they're going to have to commit, and that's what I think is the most interesting prospect, is that at some point, these stories are going to have to conclude. And where they choose to end them is something I'm really interested in. But that's what I gotta say on Jason Todd. An interesting character for sure, but one who's going to be extremely difficult to adapt, unless the world around him is as well fleshed out as he is. But I do have faith in this creative team, and I look forward to seeing how they overcome this uphill climb. Now they just gotta figure out whether or not the Batman is canon.